Welcome to the temperate coastal rainforest of southeast Alaska, home of Sitka black-tailed deer. Sitka black-tailed deer have inhabited this region for at least 10,000 years, and they play a critical role in the forest ecosystem. This deer species is also extremely important to the people of southeast Alaska. The hunting, sharing of meat, and consumption of Sitka black-tailed deer are ingrained into the culture and traditions of most rural households. Over the last half-century, the forests of southeast Alaska have extensively changed. In the 1950s and 60s, the massive Sitka spruce, western hemlock, and Alaska cedar drew the interest of the commercial logging industry. Large areas of big old-growth tree stands were clear-cut. Here, we tell a science-based story about how deer populations and deer hunting opportunities have changed with 70 years of logging and the forest change that follows. This story was motivated by local concerns that deer are less available than they used to be. The story of change in deer and deer hunting is best told on Prince of Wales Island. Prince of Wales is home to around a dozen communities with households reliant on healthy deer populations. More timber has been extracted here than anywhere else in Alaska. On Prince of Wales, the story will focus on a 10 square mile area in Steny Creek watershed. Steny is an area that most residents and deer hunters of Prince of Wales are familiar with. Steny contains a mix of all the major forest types, and it has been extensively logged. Our story quickly walks you through change in deer habitat and the consequences on deer numbers and hunting opportunity from the 1950s to present. Deer research in southeast Alaska over the last 4 decades shows that different forest types support different densities of deer and different hunting opportunities. Based on this research, high-volume old-growth forest, or a forest patch with a high density of massive trees, can sustain the highest number of deer because it provides a combination of understory deer forage and critical winter habitat. The other major forest types, in the order of deer densities that they can sustain, include clear-cuts with abundant summer forage, medium-volume old-growth, early-stage young growth, or forest clear-cut 10 to 20 years ago, thin forest, or forest that was thin to open up the canopy and facilitate faster growth of marketable timber, low-volume old-growth and muskeg containing little deer forage, and later-stage young growth that was clear-cut 20 to 30 years ago. Later-phase young growth is not good for deer or deer hunting. The dense closed canopy prevents sunlight from reaching the forest floor, and most of your deer forage dies off. So here's how the major habitat types compare. These deer densities are used to estimate change in the deer population as the forest changes. It is important not to assume that the forest types that support the most deer also are the most preferred by deer hunters. Based on surveys of hunters on Prince of Wales, muskeg, clearcut, and alpine are the most preferred habitat types for deer hunting. These habitat types are open and give hunters large fields of view. The least preferred forest types are young growth and thin forest. Based on these findings, we group habitat types into 3 categories: good, average, and poor. Once again, keep these in mind as we show how Steny has changed over the last 70 years. Now that the relationship between forest type, habitat quality, and hunting opportunity have been established, let's return to Steny to see the consequences of 70 years of change. Each decadal snapshot in time will illustrate deer numbers, habitat composition, and deer hunting opportunities. Deer numbers are represented by the black deer symbols. Different major habitat types, provided in the lower right, will have different colors. Deer hunting opportunities, the pie chart on the top left, illustrates the proportion of area in good, average, and poor hunting habitat quality. The pie chart in the top right shows the proportion of area in different habitat types. So now, let the story begin. In the 1950s, logging had not yet commenced. A mix of unlogged old-growth forest supports around 10 deer per square mile, so Steny contained roughly 100 deer and had a good proportion of high-volume old-growth to support deer during harsh winters. In the 1960s, 25% of Steny was clear-cut. This likely created an abundance of deer forage, but also reduced the area of high-volume old-growth from 23 to 15%. The trade-off between much more forage and the loss of some critical winter habitat was likely an overall net gain for deer numbers. The extensive area of new clearcut was welcomed by deer hunters, increasing the proportion of good hunting habitat by approximately 20%. More clear-cutting in the 1970s. Much of the high and medium volume old growth had now been logged, leaving less critical winter habitat. The deer forage in clear cuts and early phase young growth kept deer numbers. The pros and cons for deer was probably balanced, and the numbers returned to pre-logging levels of roughly 100 deer. The transition from clear-cut to young growth turned 25% of the area into poor hunting habitat. Moving into the 1980s, the problematic legacy of logging on deer and deer hunting is beginning to be observed. 25% of the area is now in the older phase of young growth that isn't good for deer or deer hunting. The negative trend in deer numbers continues in the 1990s, with all the clear cuts of the 60s and 70s in the older young growth phase with little deer forage. We estimated a 26% decline in deer numbers compared to pre-logging. Also, during the late 1980s and early 1990s, forest managers wishing to help growth rates of marketable tree species began thinning older young growth, represented in gray. This likely elevated deer forage availability during the snow-free season, which offset some of the negative impacts of the older young growth on deer and Steny. However, thinned forest is considered unhuntable by most deer hunters, and this habitat was likely largely avoided. By the 2000s, nearly half of Steny was poor deer habitat, and the area was no longer resilient to harsh winters. Most of the area was poor hunting habitat, and it supported 35% fewer deer than pre-logging. The canopies of the thin forest began to close again, removing the understory forage gains of thinning during the 1990s. Clear cutting has stopped because there isn't any medium or high volume old growth left to log. In the 2010s and on to the 2020s, the scenario is the same. The majority of the area is poor deer habitat and poor hunting habitat. Resilience to harsh winters has largely been lost. The summer range is no longer productive enough to help deer enter the winter season with ample fat reserves. The population has likely declined by 40% and is relatively vulnerable to mortality in a winter with above average snowfall. To summarize the effects of 70 years of forest change on deer habitat in Steny, the area has experienced a 78% decline in critical winter habitat and a 53% increase in young growth forests with limited deer forage. Deer numbers have declined by nearly 40%, going from 100 deer pre-logging to a present-day estimate of around 62. The area has experienced a 13% decline in good hunting habitat. However, the good habitat type for hunting is not likely to be visited by many hunters because the surrounding forest is sustaining fewer deer. We estimated a 53% increase in poor hunting habitat. Overall, a once popular area for deer hunting is probably largely avoided by local residents. Also, with fewer remaining pockets of good deer habitat and good deer hunting habitat, hunters may be more condensed. This leads to higher contact rates among hunters, more competition and crowding, and reduced hunting experience and overall satisfaction. Ultimately, compared to the past decades, our case study analysis suggests Steny has less deer, more challenging hunting, and a population less resilient to harsh winters. In conclusion, future projections for deer and deer hunting are not on a good trajectory. We're certain our estimates are not precise because of all the factors that influence deer numbers at a local level. However, we feel the general trend is accurate. Also, it is important to highlight the trends observed in Steny are occurring throughout Prince of Wales and other parts of southeast Alaska. Most of the log forest in southeast Alaska has or is transitioning into an older young growth phase that isn't good for deer or deer hunting. Opportunities for a better future are out there. Local residents, land managers, and researchers will need to work together to adapt to a changing landscape and to identify innovative solutions to restore habitat characteristics that sustain deer and help communities maintain traditional practices and food security.